insider, Cass Sunstein. First, I want to acknowledge our institution stands on the unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, particularly the Duwamish. We thank them for continuing use of the natural resources of their ancestral homeland. And thank you all for tuning in. Town Hall is proud to be a community-focused organization, a place where we can share and sustain ideas and creativity, even if we can't gather in person. And I'd like to thank Cass for appearing tonight to help make this possible. Town Hall will continue to produce virtual content all this fall, including our podcast, In the Moment, which features exclusive guests. And many of our past talks are available in video or podcast form in our digital media library. And Town Hall is adding new events and podcasts every day. Upcoming programs include materials scientist Ainisa Ramirez with Untold Stories of Innovation, a live recording of the Deep End Friends podcast on the subject of Black healing, and Senator Chris Murphy about America and our relationship with violence, and many more. Town Hall and the nonprofit community at large has been put under significant strain due to event cancellations and the ever-changing landscape. So we hope you'll consider extending your generosity to help support us during this difficult time by making a donation tonight and becoming a member if you're not a member. Click on the donate button at the bottom of your screen, or you can make a donation online, or you can text Town Hall to 44321 to give. Our partner booksellers have been hit by the negative effects of the COVID outbreak as well, and would greatly appreciate your support. So we encourage you to support local independent bookstores by purchasing a copy of the book being presented tonight. Use the link on this live stream page to purchase through Third Place Books. And for viewers who want to watch this broadcast with closed captioning, we recommend viewing the stream via our YouTube page, our YouTube link, here in the chat. To enable real-time closed captioning, click the CC button in the bottom right corner of the video player. The video will be available for rewatching immediately following tonight's broadcast. Tonight's presentation will be about 40 minutes, followed by Q&A. Cass will select questions from those submitted in the Ask a Question field at the bottom center of your screen. And you can also vote on which questions will be addressed by clicking the arrow next to the question to upvote it. We can't guarantee that we'll be able to address every question, but we'll try to get to as many as possible. So please keep your questions concise and in the form of a question. Town Hall's work is made possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. Our Arno Motulski Science Series is supported by Microsoft, KUOW, the Wingcoat Foundation Northwest, and the taxpayers of Washington. Finally, Town Hall is a member-supported organization, so I'd like to thank all of our members watching tonight. Now, for the heart. Cass Sunstein is an author and a professor at Harvard Law School, where he's the founder and director of the program on behavioral economics and public policy. He was the administrator of the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs during the Obama administration, and the recipient of the 2018 Holberg Prize, sometimes described as the equivalent of the Nobel Prize for Law and the Humanities. In 2020, the World Health Organization appointed him chair of its technical advisory group on behavioral insights and sciences for health. He's the author of hundreds of articles and dozens of books, including Nudge, Improving Decisions About Health, Wealth, and Happiness, written with Richard Thaler, and which was published in 2008. It was a New York Times bestseller and was named a Best Book of the Year by The Economist and Financial Times. In 2013, he published Simpler, The Future of Government, in which he endeavored to provide a new understanding of how government can work in light of our increasingly data-driven trajectory. Written with Reed Hasty, his 2014 book, Wiser, Getting Beyond Groupthink to Make Groups Smarter, gave examples from a broad range of organizations about making decisions that lead your organization to better success. Sunstein's book, Too Much Information, Understanding What You Don't Want to Know, is the subject of tonight's talk. So please join me in welcoming Cass Sunstein.
Thank you so much. Hi, Seattle. I know there's someone from the UK. Hi, everyone who's listening. This is a very personal book, actually, and it has two life events that actually helped form the project. One little life event was very recent, by the way. It didn't help form the project, but it illuminated what I'm going to say, which is I asked my 11-year-old son what he would say in answer to the question, would you like to know if the person on whom you have a crush has a crush back? He's 11, so that's kind of starting. And his answer was, no, I don't want to know that. And I informed him what is true, that in my studies, about half of America doesn't want to know the answer to that question. And I asked him why he didn't want to know. And he said, the person on whom I have a crush might not have a crush back on me. Okay, that's a clue to my topic, too much information. The life events that affected the genesis of this project, one was actually in the government, where I worked on something you may know about, which is the government, and here Obama and Trump are in agreement. The government requires calorie labels so that if you go to a restaurant, and I guess restaurants are still places one can go to, you can find out the calories associated with your meal. That's mandatory. And part of what we did in the rule in the Obama administration was apply this requirement to movie theaters. So you go to a Star Wars movie, or you go to Transformers, or you go to something from France, and you get some food, and the food will have calorie labels associated with it. So I was very excited about this, that would combat obesity and other health problems. And I sent a note to a friend saying this would apply to movie theaters also. And the friend sent me back a 3-word response by email: Cass ruined popcorn. So the answer to my celebration was, you didn't do good, or maybe you didn't do good because you ruined popcorn. And we actually have data now suggesting that a lot of people don't want to know how many calories are in their popcorn. They don't want their calories to ruin their experience of Star Wars or the French movie. So ruining popcorn is part of my theme tonight, where obtaining information sometimes causes sadness or fear or some kind of negative emotional response. And that is an important part of the picture when we think about what information we should seek, what information we should avoid, and what information either a bank or the government or Facebook or Twitter or your automobile seller should provide you with. It's part of the picture. Okay, the other personal event is actually more intimate, I confess. A number of years ago, a lot of number of years ago, big number, my dad was having balance problems. He's a very good athlete, and he was stumbling on the tennis court and stumbling as he walked up and down the stairs. So my mother said he should go see the doctor. And he spent about 6 hours there with a battery of tests. And she came back after the tests and said to him, I actually have some good news. I just talked to the doctor, and you're completely fine. It's a balance issue, but it's nothing to worry about. You'll be home in a day. They want to keep you here for some more observation, but basically green light, all's fine. Then my mother took me to the car to drive me back to college, actually, and her face fell. She became a different person, and she said, he's going to die. It's going to be pretty fast, maybe a year, maybe faster than that, and there's absolutely no hope, and I'm not going to tell him, and you're not allowed to either. I was in my 20s at the time, and that was, of course, a life rupture, that experience. And what was noteworthy about it was that she thought the right call for him was not to tell him the facts. And she also thought that the right call, I think, for her was not to tell him the facts, and that all of the family assembled would be better off if he was blissfully ignorant. She didn't want to ruin popcorn. My mother didn't. Okay, did she make the right call? I'm not exactly sure, but it was a reasoned and very thought through call, which tells us something, I think, deep about humanity and when information is too much information. Okay, those are two stories. In terms of the substance of the problem, I confess that I have a motivation, which is that when I worked in the White House, I was in charge of information disclosure, and I was in charge of information receipt by the government. So I worked on calorie labels and fuel economy labels and nutrition labels and sunscreen labels and more. And I think I didn't have an adequate handle on the problem insofar as it relates to what information people need to live longer and healthier, and what information they don't want and that they can't use. I also think in retrospect that I wasn't sufficiently fastened on a number, and I'm going to tell you a number right now. It's 11 billion. That's the number of hours in paperwork burdens that the US government imposes on the American people, meaning every year the US government requires, and that's the federal government only, not talking about the states, requires people to spend 11 billion hours filling out paperwork. Paperwork requirements are often called information collection requests, and this is too much information the government is receiving, partly because of issues of privacy, but partly, and this is what I want to emphasize, human beings don't have all the time in the world. And if you have to spend hours and hours getting a license, getting a permit, getting a visa, getting economic and educational help that maybe can turn your life around, those hours can be a Stephen King novel. That is a horror. So one of my motivations is I didn't adequately deal with these issues of too much information. The second motivation is information, as you probably have noticed, is all around us. Whether we're talking about COVID-19 or the presidential race or about some safety issue or about national security or about your community, there's so much information around. And how ought we to think about how much information is too much? Can we have a framework that can organize our individual lives when we're full of this stuff? Or can private organizations, of which many of us are part, can we help them to make better decisions about what information to provide? I'm also motivated by the fact that every day, the ability of each of us to learn more about our society, our own future, is greater than it was the day before. Every day, our capacity to learn whether we're going to get cancer or Alzheimer's, or whether we're going to make a lot of money maybe in the next 5 or 10 years, we can use better tools for giving us a purchase on those problems, so to speak. We kind of have to pay money for it sometimes. Sometimes it's free. And how should we think about that unprecedented power to learn? It's both a great gift, but in some ways it's a curse. Okay, I'm going to give you 3 themes, and I'm just going to announce them before I get to the body of the remarks. The first theme is making a plea for not ruining popcorn. Whether you are in a relationship with, family members whose popcorn you might ruin, be careful about that. Doctors should be careful about ruining popcorn. They shouldn't lie, but they should never lie but they should be attuned to the problem that my mother was attuned to and that what my friend was attuned to in worrying over calorie labels at movie theaters. The second plea is that 11 billion hours in paperwork requirements. That's a scandal, and all of us should know about it. It needs a term, a noun, and I'm going to suggest one, sludge. That material that the government is acquiring from us, often every day from large numbers of people, that is sludge, and that 11 billion hours needs to be cut dramatically. Doesn't matter whether you're Republican or Democrat, doesn't matter whether you're a small business or a large business, a patient, a nurse, a doctor, there needs to be less sludge. The third proposal I'm going to make is that we need social media to be used about 10% less. And I'm going to give you some data suggesting that social media is ruining our popcorn, and we need to take some steps to scale it back so we can enjoy the popcorn of life, let's call it, a little bit better. Okay, now what I'm going to do is give you some data about America, and then I'm going to give you a framework to think about how much information is too much information. Then we're going to talk about a little bit about sludge, and then we're going to be basically over to questions. Okay, so I have asked America, basically, do you want to know if the person on whom you have a crush has a crush on you? About 58% of people say yes, 42% say no. I actually asked college undergraduates, how many of you would you like to know if the person on whom you have a crush has a crush on you? And almost everyone, basically out of a large group, only one said I don't want to know. All the rest wanted to know. Okay, that's a puzzle. Why do the 42% not want to know? A bunch of them probably think, I'm married, I don't really care. A bunch of them probably think, I'm not very likable. They probably don't like me the way I like them. And why would I want to know that? And a bunch of them probably thought, that's trouble. If I learn that, then my life is going to be disrupted in ways that I don't want. People don't want to be disappointed, and they don't want information that's not useful. That's a way into this topic. Only 43% of Americans want to know the calories in their meals. The majority doesn't want to know. That's interesting to me because a large majority likes the rule that says restaurants have to disclose their calories. They like the rule, but they don't want personally to know. That's probably because they think it's going to be less fun to go to the restaurant. The biggest loser in terms of the percentage of people who want information is what's the likely year of their death. Almost 75% of people say, don't tell me. I don't want to know that. Or whether people are going to get Alzheimer's disease, it's about 50-50. Half want to know, half don't. Whether you're going to get cancer, a little higher, about 58% want to know. Whether, I ask people whether they want to know what their friends and family really think of them, 58% don't want to know. Apparently they think that they fear that their friends and family like them slightly less than they hope, and they don't want to hear. I asked America basically, how many of you want to know how much warmer the planet's going to be in 2100 related to climate change? 58% don't want to know. I asked people, do you want to know if your spouse or partner cheats on you? Most did, 57%, but pretty close to half, 43%, not far short of half, don't want to know. 53% of people want to know if there's a heaven. 47% don't want to know. Only 44% want to know if there's a hell. Maybe they're scared. They don't want to hear. For information that bears on consumer stuff, like safety ratings for tires, side effects of pain relievers, things like that, a majority wants to know, close to 2/3, but about 1/3 doesn't want to know. I also asked people, and I now have data not only from the United States, but from a whole bunch of countries, and it's pretty parallel in lots of countries that are different in many ways from the US. People aren't willing to pay a lot to get this information, even if they want it. So if they want information about calorie labels, if they want information about how hot it's going to be in 2100, they'd pay maybe $100 a year. That's something. It's not trivial, but they're not going to pay $110. $100 is basically their ceiling. Okay, I hope this gives you a kind of picture of two things. First, the percentage of people who want information that would seem to bear on their lives, it's rarely 80% or 90%. It's usually in the vicinity of 45% to 55%. A good chunk of people just don't want to know. That means there's a lot of diversity out there with respect to what people want to know. It also means that people who want to know things of the sort we've been discussing, often they don't want to know it all that much. They're not willing to pay a whole lot to get the door opened into the tree of knowledge. They don't care that much about the tree of knowledge. Okay, I confess that after I did a bunch of surveys of people, I thought, I don't know what to make of this. There's diversity out there. For year of death, it's really low. For safety ratings of tires, it's a whole lot higher. I just don't know what's going on here. Here's an effort to provide a little framework to understand what people want to know and what they want not to know. And I'm going to bring that to bear on some issues, really fundamental issues about human nature, and also some really fundamental issues about public policy. Okay, the first thing is people who want information often want it for one reason. They can use it. And they're making a kind of call about, will this improve my life? The 43% of people who want the calorie labels, and that's a good chunk, they're thinking, I sure do, because I want to stay healthy. The 67% of people who want safety ratings for tires are thinking that that's good to know, that I can buy a tire that is safer than I'd otherwise get. Some information we can use to make our lives better. And I'm kind of talking to you, Food and Drug Administration, and you, Environmental Protection Agency, that part of their job is to tell us things that we can employ in order to make healthier or environmentally preferable choices in the next year. This very much bears, of course, on COVID-19. But some information in terms of our lives and what we can do with it, we don't care. It doesn't matter to us. So for a lot of people who are saying, I don't want that information, what they're saying is actually it's of no use to me. So the 57% of people who don't want the calorie labels are thinking, I'm not going to change my behavior if I get the calorie label. It's just not a big deal for me. They're thinking a calorie label is like a story in the newspaper that I'm really not interested in. Okay, I think a more intriguing problem is some information is actually bad to have. It's not good for your life. If you learn, for example, as a lawyer, that your client is guilty, you might be a worse lawyer. If you learn about the race or gender of your applicants, you might think, I don't completely trust myself not to discriminate. I want to be blinded to all that. There's a lot of information that people are making kind of rough and ready call to the effect that getting it is actually a negative. It's not merely not useful, it's affirmatively harmful. Okay, there's a second factor, and here I'm trying to develop a little framework that I think is more intriguing, which is people are asking, like my 11-year-old son, not wanting to know if the person on whom he has a crush on him. People are thinking, how would that make me feel? And when people say, I don't want to know the year I'm going to die, it's that's like a tombstone that you're staring at. I don't want that. And when people don't want calorie labels, they're often thinking the calorie label is actually going to make me enjoy my meal less. And I don't want that. People check the stock market, their portfolios, more when the stock market's going up than when it's going down. That doesn't make any sense, except that when it's going up, they think they're going to smile. And when it's going down, they think that they're going to frown, and they want to avoid the frown. So too, in experiments, when people think they're doing well on tasks, they want to know how they're doing. When they think they're not doing well on tasks, they don't want to know. They'll actually pay something not to know. And I now have data suggesting in multiple countries, people are willing to pay something not to get information when they think it'll make them sad. So there's information that make people happy. Maybe they think they'll get great news about, the fuel economy of their car. So they want to know that. Or maybe they think they're going to get neutral news about calorie labels. It's not going to make them happy or sad, but it's going to be a nice balance in terms of information and usefulness, and maybe a little good news, maybe a little bad news. Go for it. And that will affect their judgment. The third factor, I have a barking dog. Would you excuse me just for a moment? And my dog's barking serendipitously just as a moment that I'm going to talk about dogs. I promise I will be back within 30 seconds, probably less. My very photogenic dogs have just been liberated from their prison. And this is serendipitous because there's a third reason people want to get information sometimes. It's because it's interesting. So even if it doesn't make them happy or sad or scared or relaxed, and even if it's not very useful, they might be really curious about it. And here's an example. I don't know if this will interest you, but whether dogs are related to wolves and exactly how seems to me an extremely intriguing question that I'm interested in knowing the answer to, even though it's not very useful to me. The fact that my dogs were barking just then is disconnected, I believe, from whether they're related to wolves or not. And it's not especially thrilling to hear that they're related to wolves or that they're not related to wolves. It's just an interesting question. Okay, so now we have a little framework, don't we? And I hope this is going to resonate for you. That sometimes information is useful and people want it for that reason. Sometimes information makes people happy and people want it for that reason. Sometimes information is useless or harmful and just makes people sad. People don't want to know whether they're going to get Alzheimer's because I think on average, most people think, can't do anything about it and it's just going to make me scared. And some information people want to get, even though it doesn't make them particularly happy or sad and it's not useful, but because they're curious. And now we have an explanation for the data, which is that people balance these three factors in different ways. Okay, I want to say now that there are some distortions in the human mind that screw us up with respect to information acquisition. And I feel apologetic as a professor for having used the word screw us up, but I think that is the right way to think about it. So I'm going to talk about a couple features of how human minds work that will lead us to be less interested in getting information than we should be. The first is people tend to think that today really matters and tomorrow's important and the future is a foreign country, call it Laterland, and I'm not sure I'm ever going to visit. So when people acquire information or avoid information, they're often thinking about this week, not about this life. That's a problem. If you aren't interested in information that bears on your health, then it might be that nothing bad is going to happen in 2020, but something really bad is going to happen in 2030. And that's you to whom it's happening. So the fact that human beings tend to focus on the short term and not the long term, it's called present bias, can screw us up. The second problem, and it's both a blessing and a problem, is goes by the name of optimistic bias. So on average, human beings are unrealistically optimistic. That's just how the human species is. Not everyone in every context, but people tend to be. And if you think about what makes the human animal successful, this is part of it. If we're optimistic about how life is going to go, then we're more likely to do what needs to be done to make it go well. If we are unrealistically optimistic, then we might not seek information in circumstances in which we really need it. So the framework which I'm suggesting helps explain the data and the ruining popcorn is correct, but it doesn't acknowledge that if we focus on the short term and if we're unrealistically optimistic, we will often fail to obtain information that might save our lives. And if you're thinking about politics, good, whatever your political preferences are, unrealistic optimism and focus on the short term can, I'm trying not to use the word screw up, can harm our judgments about politics as well as our judgments about personal life. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about policy. Human beings, you may have noticed, are really different. And my data suggests that people are really different from one another in what information they want. If we look at one of the most pressing problems our society faces, that is mental illness, we can see this problem like with a vengeance. And I think that is the right word. So people who suffer from depression typically don't want to know. They just don't want to know. And the fact that they don't want to know is both a reflection of depression, and it can lead to an absence of seeking information that can fortify depression. So the state of being depressed can lead to information avoidance, and information avoidance can lead to depression, and it's a terrible spiral. And we need to figure out ways to do something about that. By contrast, people who suffer from anxiety issues, at least from some kinds of anxiety disorders, they need to know. They kind of need to know everything. They're anxious when they don't know. And that too can be a different kind of spiral, where the desire to learn can spur a search for information, which can increase anxiety. And the increased anxiety can then spur the search for information. And I hope this is resonating with all of us, whether we suffer from depression or anxiety. We've kind of been there on both counts with respect to avoidance of information, which can be a reflection of and a cause of depression, and kind of obsessive information seeking, which can be a reflection of and a cause of anxiety issues. Okay, that's a policy problem. So too is the issue that I dealt with when I was in government, which was about calorie labels and fuel economy labels and labeling genetically engineered food and labeling sunscreen. What the government should be thinking of, I propose, and forgive if this is a little kind of policy wonk stuff, is what are the human consequences of a disclosure mandate? The government should think, are we making people better off or not? And if you have information that basically makes people really scared and isn't useful to them, there's a good argument that that's not a public policy priority. So if you bought a mortgage or a medicine where the mortgage has 70 incomprehensible pages that just make you feel powerless and intimidated, the law shouldn't require that. If you get a medicine that is overwhelmingly likely to help you, but in 1 in a zillion cases causes some side effect, it's a fair question to ask whether the law should require that list of things, which isn't useful for many, or maybe for any, but which only serves to discourage people from using a helpful medicine or from making them scared when they take a medicine that really is going to help them and potentially save their lives. So my little plea here is that when we're talking about information disclosure, either voluntary by companies, financial institutions, Microsoft, Facebook, or a government one, we ought to have in mind of insistent focus, is this really helping people or not? And try to be as disciplined as we can in figuring out the answer to that question. Let me just put my cards on the table a little bit here. Calorie labels are a good idea. Even though only 43% of people want them personally, the 57% who get them, it's not very harmful. And for the 43%, it's really, really helpful. And if you look at how much the 43% wants it, they want it pretty much. They'd pay $100 for it. And how much does the 57% not want it? They wouldn't pay anything for it, but they don't really hate it on average. So calorie labels, hooray for them, even if they ruin some popcorn. Labels for genetically engineered food, organisms, I'm a little more cautious about that on the ground that we have data suggesting that the principal consequence of that is to make people frightened that the food they're about to eat is dangerous for them, when the government's own judgment under both Democratic and Republican leadership is it's not dangerous. So you scare people for no good reason. So that's a cautionary note. Okay, sludge. There is sludge all around us. If you try to get economic help amidst COVID-19, if you're a little company or a patient or someone who's unemployed, you have to encounter sludge. The Earned Income Tax Credit is one of our best anti-poverty programs, and it's pretty well run. 20% of eligible Americans don't get it. It's because of sludge. That 20% is, last I checked, well over 1 million. I'm going to be kind of conservative and say it's 1.5 million. That's real human beings, though it's just a number. It's real people who are not benefiting from a program that can change their lives and their children's lives, not only in the short term, but in the long term. And the reason they're not getting it is sludge. With respect to occupational licenses, in many states, people can't get licenses to do things like cut hair or be landscape architects without wading through a lot of sludge. And the problem is not just the time, which is extraordinary, but the effects of the time, which is to prevent people from getting things to which they are legally entitled. They give up. It might be education. They give up. We've seen a little bottom-up war on sludge in the last months, where both state governments and local governments and also the federal government have tried to take away sludge to help people who are sick or frightened or struggling economically. But this shouldn't be a COVID-only enterprise. This should be a kind of all-hands-on-deck enterprise by which those 11 billion hours in paper requirements, and in addition, waiting time and administrative burdens of all kinds, are lifted from the backs of the American people. I promised I'd tell you something about Facebook, and this is what I'm going to end on, though it's broader than Facebook. It's Twitter, it's social media in general. The data explored in the book suggests that if you ask Americans whether they'd give up use of social media for the next month, they'd say, you're going to have to pay me. They don't want to give it up. A lot of them will say, you have to pay me about $100. I'll give up use of social media, and it's about the same for the various platforms. I'll give it up for a month if you pay me $100. Okay. In a very good bit of research, people were given $100 to give up use of social media platform. And the consequence was that in the next month, they were happier, they were more satisfied with their lives, they were less likely to be depressed, they were less likely to be anxious. On every measure of well-being, they were better off without as much information as they had previously received from the platform. So here's a case where their lived experience was that the platform was providing them with too much information as measured by the experience of their lives. After the month, they were asked, okay, you've had a month without. Now how much would you demand to go without for another month? And on average, those who had said $100 said $87. They demanded less. They learned. But they still demanded $87. People are demanding money to give up something that makes them sadder. The upshot of this work, I think, is that 10% less time on social media for many of us is a good idea. We're getting too much information. Okay, I'm going to give you a little poetry and literature to end, but I just want to fix the main ideas. Idea number one, information in a free society is indispensable. It is useful. It helps us enjoy our lives often. It helps us smile more and be fuller human beings. Still, please beware of the risk of ruining popcorn in your own life and in your family and in your work. It's a real risk. Attend, if you would, to the emotional consequences of what you're learning, because you only have one life. It's not a rehearsal. Second, let's all, shall we, do whatever we can to reduce sludge, make a little vow to cut sludge from someone's life in the next month, even if it's just our own. And third, a little less information from information sources that are making us sad. Okay, two bits of literature for you. One is from Thomas Gray, The Ode on a Distant Prospect of Eton College. It's a very moving poem where he's writing about young people who are full of joy. And he, from the perspective of an older poet, is just exploring their joy and delight and life. And he ends, yet, why should they know their fate? Since sorrow never comes too late, and happiness too swiftly flies, thought would destroy their paradise. No more. Where ignorance is bliss, 'tis folly to be wise. My last quotation is a counterpoint. That is, it's a counter argument against Gray, urging that ignorance is bliss. And it's from my favorite novel. It's called Possession by A.S. Byatt. And the question asked by a character who's a poet is in a love letter to his incipient soulmate. And here are his words. I cannot bear not to know the end of a tale. I will read the most trivial things once commenced, only out of a feverish greed to be able to swallow the ending, sweet or sour, and to be done with what I need never have embarked on. Are you in my case, or are you a more discriminating reader? Do you lay aside the unprofitable? Thank you, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much for that fascinating lecture. I'm Shane. I'm an event manager here at Town Hall Seattle, and we're going to move on now to audience questions. So I invite you to ask any questions you might have. If you're in Crowdcast, you can do it down below in the Ask the Question button. If you're in your YouTube, you can put your question in the chat, and I'll be monitoring that as well. And just a reminder, if you can try to keep your questions short and concise, just so we can try to get to everybody's. So our first question comes from Richard, and Richard asks, the information is fascinating. How can I use it in my personal life? What changes would you suggest that I or others make so that we actually get the information we need?
Okay, so since I've worked on this, I've tried to apply it to my own life. And if there's information that is very useful, like it would help me avoid a risk of COVID-19 or help me find something that will make next week really good, then I'm all over it. But if it's information that is going to take me down a rabbit hole where I'm going to click on one thing and then on another thing and find out what some politician did that's terrible and what another politician did that's good, that has no use for me, it's a little like heroin. I've never used heroin, so I don't really know. But a tiny, tiny bit like heroin, stop the addiction. Don't do that. And also, I'm more attuned, and I think we all should be, to whether information that we're looking for is making our lives better. Is it just scaring us, or is it making us really sad? So to focus on that, it's not the only thing that matters, because sadness and fear are parts of life and they can be productive. But to be attuned to what the information is doing to your soul, that's a good thing. To tune out of some things sometimes is restorative.
Our next question comes from Mark, and Mark asks, when requirements for hazardous materials safety data sheets were introduced in the mid-'80s, the intervention logic suggested people needed to know how to manage their individual risks when handling or using these materials. It didn't take long for these short 2-page documents to blow up to 16+ pages when companies feared excess liability due to the disclosures they made. When it comes to highly technical, complex topics, how do we get the balance right?
That's such a great question. So thank you for that. And when I worked in the White House, my brothers and sisters, meaning lawyers, I am a lawyer, were, let's say, not always a constructive force, because the 2-page disclosure, they would want to be a much longer disclosure so as to avoid any legal risks. But sometimes maybe creating a legal risk of some magnitude, maybe, I hope it's small, is worth it so that you make your information disclosure useful. That's a lot of words. Let me suggest that the fuel economy label now, it's not perfect, but it's pretty good and it's simple. And if you want more information, you can just click on the fuel economy website and find out a ton. Often a simple disclosure that tells people the essentials of what they need to know is better than 16 or 20 pages. And then giving people who are curious or, technically minded an opportunity to learn much more. Haven't we always all experienced this in our own lives? This happened to me very recently where for a forum not unlike this one, someone wanted me to do something and I was very pleased to do it, but they sent me 8 pages of instructions. And I thought, OMG, I think is the expression. And that's a trivial example, but if you're buying a house or a car or going to a school, or you have kids, or you have parents who are facing health problems, if they're giving you 16 pages of sludge, not good. Give you, if feasible, give you the short, simple version, which could be, make it a 1-pager or an executive summary.
Our next question comes from Lily, and I believe Lily was our audience member watching from the UK, so thank you for being here. Lily asks, too much information in the era of fake news and conspiracy theories in the middle of a COVID-19 pandemic. How to communicate effectively what matters?
Okay, great. So what I've been focusing so far is truthful information. If there's misinformation, then each of us has a challenge to try to figure out what's true and what's not. And then information providers have a challenge, which is to try to provide information that's true. Now, for each of us, and this is a little bit risky, but to think what are trusted sources for us, and to be very humble about our judgment on that count is probably a good idea. So if there are people who you know in life who basically have sound judgment, or if there are scientists or media outlets who you know, maybe you like their politics, maybe you don't, but you kind of trust them not to lie, to pay attention to them is a really good idea. And if you have something that's unsourced or sourced by one person, or maybe by someone who has a economic or other interest, to discount it is a very, very good thing. In terms of the information providers who are trying to communicate what's true, to think of, okay, so I'll tell you a word I learned in the US government that is one of about 8 words I'd never heard that are terrible words. They're not swear words. So this could be, children, you're welcome to keep listening. The word is validator. And it's a terrible word because, you know, it has so many syllables and it doesn't have an obvious meaning. The word validator is meant by someone who isn't you, who's willing to validate that what you're saying is true. And if you could have a trusted validator who is willing to say, you know, that rumor, don't believe that one, that's nonsense. And if that validator is trusted by the particular community, then it can be pure gold.
So this next question comes from Michelle, and Michelle asks, your wife has praised your ability, no matter where you are, to be able to turn on your laptop and resume where you left off working. How are you able to pick up where you left off so easily? Do you ever experience "now where was I" syndrome? How do you organize your thoughts when writing, or were you bitten by some radioactive spider?
I was bitten by a radioactive spider, but I didn't get any superpowers. I just got like this red welt. That's not true. Don't we all think that different projects in our lives have different like startup time? So if you're going to do a sport, sometimes some of us, we can just start and run, and others need to, you know, do a little bit first so you don't get hurt or stiff. And for some writing, like if you're writing a letter to someone you love, it might be you can just start up immediately, or it might be that one's really hard and you have to think for a bit. So I just personally, I often, this may be in the nature of too much information, so I'm repeating the thesis of my book. This might not make you happy or be useful. But in the shower, I often find is a time when you can frame something that you're writing. I'm not sure why, but if there are places that are peaceful and where the mind isn't flowing with nonsense or overload, that's a time when to plot out something. I often find if you have the first paragraph of something, you're launched, and then your fingers can do the thinking. But if the fingers won't think, they won't generate the first paragraph. That's how it feels, at least.
Mm-hmm. Our next question comes from Mark, and Mark asks, there's a little bit of lead up to the question. So Mark says, your thesis seems familiar. Barry Schwartz warned us that choices become more difficult when we have too many alternatives. What role should government play in helping ensure people not only have access to the information they need to make informed choices, but also that such information is well organized? Do we depend too heavily on market-based mechanisms, such as Google, to perform this role, or organize all the world's information and make it accessible?
Okay, great. So let's separate two different ideas. One is that, which some behavioral scientists have, that too many choices can be a problem. And I guess if you phrase it that way, no one could disagree. But I'm very cautious about the idea that too many choices are a bad thing. So if you go on Amazon or your favorite web or Netflix, you got a lot of choices, and that's not a bad thing. So sometimes it is. If you're trying to choose a healthcare plan and they give you 70,000, that's probably not the best. But if they give you a bunch of books or movies, that's fine. I'm trying to argue something very different, really, which is that if the government's extracting too much information from people, that's the sludge problem. That can be terrible. And if we are flooded with information that is not useful and that makes us upset, that's a serious problem. And that for all of us in our lives and for government to keep those problems in mind is like really important. It's fundamentally important for public health and safety, possibly above all, but also if your focus is on equality on the basis of race and sex, information disclosure can be a problem if it's done in a way that helps some and hurts others. And also information disclosure should be done in a way that is promoting the right social goals. Just bracketing the question what those are. Okay, it can be the case that the government can, give simple disclosures with respect to things that people really need to know if they're buying a house. Or if you're taking a medicine, you really need to know these 3 things. But there are 15 other things that are good to know, but not need to know. And the government could put those in a bit different place. Maybe supplemental information for those who want, or a website. And that's one opportunity the government has. And also government can structure information. So if you're buying a healthcare plan or a retirement plan, the government can provide information in a way that doesn't just make you tear, for me, this isn't a good metaphor, tear your hair out. But for some people, tearing their hair out would result in a big loss. And the distress that causes that from having to navigate a very complicated information overload situation can be remedied by good design.
Mm-hmm. Our next question comes from Putnam. And Putnam asks, often disclosure requirements are a response to pressure from advocates who hope that the information will make someone else change their behavior. Farmers not planting GMO crops might be an example. How can standards be developed to insist that newly required information will actually help people improve their lives?
Okay, that's a fantastic point. So many cities and governments and private entities are interested in disclosing things involved, sugar in soft drinks, to be very prominent disclosure of that, more prominent than we have. It's not hidden, but it's not as prominent. And their hope is partly that consumers will adjust their behavior, but partly, as you say, it's that producers will stop selling as many high sugar beverages. And one of the goals of information disclosure, this is explored in the book, is not to affect consumers so much, but to affect producers and get them to alter. Completely right. And that's, it depends on the context, but that can be a very honorable thing to do. And that could have very good human consequences. For those who are interested in animal welfare, and I mention this not only because I am interested in animal welfare, but also because my Labrador Retriever, who interrupted this talk, is within 3 inches of me right now. And there are things that can be done involving disclosure that would help, let's say, the better angels of our nature do a little bit better with respect to animal welfare. But maybe that's not your issue. Your issue might be about climate change, and disclosure requirements with respect to greenhouse gas emissions could result in different behavior by energy providers. And there's no question that disclosure of various kinds has had very impressive environmental benefits over the last 20 years.
So this next question, unfortunately I don't have a name attached to it, but this person asks a pretty obvious reply to the idea that we should not list the extremely rare side effects of a net very beneficial medication is that it is paternalistic, which seems true of a lot of nudging or choice architecture. If people have irrational or overly risk-averse reactions to the minuscule probabilities, why should the government cater to that?
Okay, so the basic idea is that any information disclosure has a paternalistic element, I think. People can find the information on their own, probably. And if the government is giving you information about calories or fuel economy or nutritional content of food, they are trying to promote your agency by making sure your choices are informed. But by choosing those things rather than other things and requiring it, there is a paternalistic element. I don't think that's a dirty word. A GPS device is paternalistic. It gives you guidance about how to get where you want to go. I think that's a good way to think about a lot of things. They help you get where you want to go. I wouldn't say that people who need a GPS device or calorie labels or fuel economy labels are irrational. It's that either we're imperfectly informed or we suffer from behavioral biases, from which we probably also benefit. And if the government can overcome our unrealistic optimism that we're going to be able to find our way home by making available, as the government actually did, the underlying information, that's fine. If the government is saying we're not going to mandate telling you about the side effects because it's not going to be useful for you, not sure how to avoid at least a little paternalism. So if the government mandates the disclosure of, let's say, minimally useful information, that's kind of paternalistic. And if the government doesn't, it's also kind of paternalistic. And probably the whole point of disclosure of side effects is to help people to make informed judgments about risks and not to do things that will make them unhealthy. And if you tell them things where the risks are, purely theoretical, people probably wouldn't want that. In fact, I'm pretty confident people wouldn't want that. And then if you don't give people information they don't want, that doesn't sound terribly paternalistic.
So we have time for 2 more questions. So these are going to be our last 2. Our next question comes from Deanna. What do you think explains the media being biased to print bad news more than positive stories?
There's a saying, if it bleeds, it leads. And there's data suggesting actually that things that are surprising or vivid or disgusting do better than things that aren't those things. So if one of the goals of information providers is to stay in business, then there's a incentive that isn't the best incentive.
And this is going to be our last question for the evening. Dave asks, how do you define sludge?
Okay, great. Thank you for that. So think of sludge as frictions. That is, things that are between people and things they want, or destinations they'd like to go. So examples would be paperwork burdens, interview requirements, waiting time, hold times on the phone, and the 11 billion hours, which are paperwork burdens. That's a big component of sludge, but it's not everything. If you've ever tried to get a loan or a license or a permit, you've encountered it.
Great. Well, I want to thank everybody for tuning in, and thank you, Cass, for being here this evening with us. If you enjoyed this event, you can find many more like it on our website, townhallseattle.org. We hope you will consider making a donation, as your support will allow us to continue to provide events just like this one. If you are interested in purchasing a copy of Cass's book, Too Much Information, Understanding What You Don't Want to Know, please use the link on this live stream page to purchase through our friends at Third Place Books. And finally, thank you again for being here. Have a great evening, everybody.